Welcome to another Military History Verbalized podcast. And today we talk about Canada in World War II. And we have a special guest, Jesse from Canada. Hello, Jesse.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Glad to have you here. Could you give a short introduction on your professional background, please?
Sure, I held a master's degree in modern history from the University of Vienna, and I've worked as a historical researcher in Canada for different museums, different government agencies. So I spent some time kind of searching through archives and things like that. And I have also worked in France as a First World War battlefield tour guide, and I currently work at a university here in Vienna.
To start off, can you give a basic overview about Canada in the Second World War, so the most important aspects, before we focus more on the naval, air, and land warfare later on?
Sure. Well, Canada's role, I think, in both world wars is not necessarily that well known outside the country. I mean, we're not a world superpower or anything like that. We don't appear in all the geopolitical calculations very significantly, but Canada did make a significant contribution, both in terms of the industrial war effort, but also on in the air, on land, and at sea. And the country was also quite affected by the war internally, and that kind of goes both ways. So how the country was able to wage the war was affected by the kind of country we are. So I'll try to weave in a few examples of that for your audience, who I suppose are probably mostly not Canadians. So we'll take it slow.
And one interesting aspect was that I read up you had about 1 million manpower provided to the war, but you
That
mentioned earlier that only about half of that was actually deployed outside of Canada.
that's true. The country's population in 1939 was about 11 million people. And over the course of the war, about 1.1 million men and women, so that includes like the women's auxiliary services and so on, wore the uniform. Now, uh, nearly half of those people served inside Canada, so they weren't in combat or in theaters where combat was taking place. And part of the reason for that is political, domestic politics, right? Canada is a heterogeneous country, and that makes coordinated policy where people can die pretty tricky, right? Because not everybody accepts the same reasons for participating in a war. In Canada's case, the trauma of the First World War, where military conscription was imposed, most French Canadians, which are about a quarter of the population, were not so enthusiastic about fighting for the British Empire, since we'd been a colony of the empire and were still, let's say, in the orbit of Britain in 1939. Most French Canadians and some immigrant groups, Germans, Italians, Ukrainians, for example, were not so enthusiastic about serving overseas. And it was very difficult politically to impose forced military service. And that's pretty much the reason why there's a relatively low proportion of Canadians in uniform who ended up serving in combat theaters.
And what was the job mostly doing at home? I mean, I know there were a lot of POW camps in Canada, I think also due to the distance to Europe. So basically, if somebody got out, well, he couldn't go back.
Right. Generally speaking, that's true. Yeah. Um, well, there was a scare in Canada about the safety of Canada itself. Now, in retrospect, that seems not so realistic,
Yeah.
right? Um, when war breaks out and France is defeated and Japan is racing ahead in the Pacific, there was a lot of hype about what happens if Canada's under threat and so on. So these divisions of troops who were conscripted, but the law said, well, for the first 3 years of the war, The law said you can be conscripted, but you cannot be forced to serve in combat or serve overseas. So they were just stationed along the coast in British Columbia and on the Atlantic coast. They were guarding facilities, training. They were listening to lots of motivational speeches about why they should volunteer to go and be subject to combat and join combat units, although most of them didn't. And the veteran guard, so older guys who had served in World War One, they were still in uniform, or they were, let's say, put back into uniform, and they were the ones guarding the prisoner of war camps. And there were about 34,000 Axis prisoners of war who were interned in Canada, mostly in the middle of nowhere, of course. We have a lot of that, so it's pretty useful if you have somebody who might be useful to the other side and you catch him and you don't want him to get back, you basically send him to the middle of nowhere, and that's us. There's one awesome case, just a crazy anecdote. There was one guy, just because you mentioned that it's impossible to get back or it's hard to get back, one guy did. One German Air Force Luftwaffe officer was captured in 1940 by the British and then shipped to Canada. And he's the only one on record that I know of who managed to escape, jumped out of a train while being transported to the camp, made his way across the border to the US, which was still neutral at the time, made it down to Mexico, and got back to Germany, rejoined the Luftwaffe, and then 6 months later was killed in a training accident.
Oh,
But yeah, yeah, a little ironic, all that effort to die in a training accident. But yeah, there you have it.
yeah, it makes sense. When the United States is still neutral, then it can work. But after December 1941, I guess it would have been impossible.
No chance.
So, now I actually came up with now an interesting question. How in I know Canada is very well known nowadays for resources and oil, but how was this back in the Second World War?
Well, Canada's reputation as, let's say, America Light, as a destination for people looking for a new chance at life or for open spaces or different opportunities was there. Certainly, the British knew about the natural resources that Canada had to offer because, well, we were a colony providing them with that for a couple of hundred years. And again, in the First World War, we played a similar role. The Germans also knew, because of the experience many Germans had of immigrating to Canada. In fact, as another small side note, one of the collecting areas at Auschwitz for people's goods was referred to as the Canada warehouse because it was so full of riches when they were piling them up there. So this idea about Canada as a place of natural riches was certainly there in the minds of Europeans, and the British obviously wanted to use it. And Canada obliged. This is one thing Canada wanted to do. The government was very hesitant to send a lot of troops into combat because they were afraid to have the same experience as World War One, where 66,000 were killed. The government had to impose conscription. French Canadians rioted in the streets. English Canadian troops were brought in and shot at them. So that has to be avoided, right? How can you avoid that? You can try to convince the British that you can contribute in other ways by giving them resources. And we certainly did. For example, about half of all the Allied aluminum that was used, or aluminium for your British listeners, was used for aircraft production. All this came from Canada, as well as 90% of the nickel. So in case you were wondering, fast facts about Canadian nickel production, there you go.
So this also brings us now to the naval side, because if you transport something back then or even today, it's usually from with shipping. So what were the contributions from Canada in terms of of naval warfare, mainly for the Battle of the Atlantic? I'm not sure if in the Pacific you had anything.
Yes, there was some contribution in the Pacific, a couple of ships, but it was in no way comparable to the Atlantic War, obviously. Canada had experience with the convoy system from the previous World War, so the main role of the Canadian Navy, the Royal Canadian Navy, was to provide escort duty, escort ships for convoys, which involved both reactive protection against submarine attacks, but also sometimes hunting. The Air Force was involved as well, of course. Mostly the Canadians used smaller ships, so the Canadian Navy didn't have, battleships and things like that, or aircraft carriers. It's mostly frigates, corvettes, destroyers, that sort of level of combat ship with primarily the anti-U-boat function. In addition, sort of, let's say, operationally, Canada was given, or the Canadian Navy was given responsibility for coordinating the operations in the Northwest Atlantic for a couple of years. And part of that side of it was the occupation of Iceland. So the British decided that to secure the North Atlantic communications routes, that Iceland had to be occupied, and it was in 1940 by British troops. But of course, the British needed to use the troops, and Canada obliged by sending, my grandfather's infantry division actually, to occupy Iceland for a short period of time until the US in turn relieved those Canadian troops. And the other major Canadian responsibility in the North Atlantic was trying to close the so-called mid-Atlantic gap. So the Atlantic gap was a wide patch of ocean where you couldn't easily reach with air cover based either in Newfoundland or in the UK or in Greenland. You couldn't easily cover that central spot in the ocean with aircraft to hunt for subs. So that was the most dangerous spot for some time for the convoys. And one of the Royal Canadian Air Force's roles was to fly from Iceland to try to cover that gap as much as possible. Eventually, there were enough long-range bombers around that the gap was more or less closed. The other thing I wanted to mention was later in the war, the Royal Canadian Navy was assigned the flank coverage duty on D-Day, basically to secure both ends of the channel against any potential submarine incursions, which might have disrupted the transporting of troops and equipment and supplies and so on across the channel on D-Day and shortly afterwards. And it's quite an achievement, I think. I'm not a nationalist by any means, but if you just think militarily and organizationally, the Canadian Navy started the war with 7 ships and finished the war as, depending on the source, the 4th or 5th largest navy on the planet.
That's definitely a quite impressive build-up. And also, I mean, I think this is very interesting from more global perspective, that what the Allies did very well in terms of division of labor to a certain degree. You could say that, for instance, Canada was assigned mainly the anti-submarine warfare role, where they had veteran specialists. I mean, of course, if they were also assigned during D-Day, which was one of the largest navies ever in operation, that they provided the area there. And whereas, for instance, the Axis usually, which I call them a dysfunctional family, or some call them a bunch of predators, usually were very bad at doing this division of labor, where they said, okay, you are good at that, and you can do this, or something along those lines. This is very interesting to see why also the Allies on a bigger, on the grand strategic level, were sometimes quite way more effective due to the coordination and putting the right people or the right forces for the right mission.
Yeah, I mean, I think coalition warfare is hard, but if you can manage it, it's an advantage over your opponent.
Yeah. Now, in terms of air warfare, you already mentioned that they were covering the Mid-Atlantic Gap, but as far as I know, they also produced a lot of bombers for Great Britain, and also I'm not sure, probably also provided some squadrons or some other stuff. I'm not well aware about contributions in the air warfare besides building bombers.
Yeah, I mean, Canada had a relatively strong, given the size of the country, industrial base, especially thanks to U.S. companies opening up branch plants in Canada. Now, that was the case for land vehicles, but as far as the aircraft are concerned, during the war, Canada built about 14,000 aircraft of different types. I don't have the breakdown of heavy bombers versus medium bombers versus fighter aircraft, but I mean, 14,000 aircraft is quite a significant chunk. Some say, some texts I've read highlight the training program, the so-called Commonwealth Air Training Program, as Canada's most significant contribution to the air war. It's not sexy. It's not super exciting. There's not like blood and guts and glory happening when you're training a bunch of guys on how to fly, but that's pretty useful to your war effort. And during the war, about 130,000 pilots were trained from the whole British Empire on Canadian soil. And at one point, they were turning out about 1,400 a month trained pilots. And that's a pretty key thing if you're an island power and the only combat arm that you can use to strike back at your enemy is the air arm, which was the case for the British for quite some time during the war. But of course, there were also Canadian pilots and air crew who were involved in combat. The most prominent role was in Bomber Command as a part of the British Bomber Command. There was one of the Bomber Command groups consisted, I believe, of 14 Canadian squadrons of Lancaster bombers, including one French-Canadian squadron as well. And they participated for years, obviously, in the carpet bombing of German cities and industrial areas.
Very interesting point about training, because this is what a lot of people usually miss, but those people who watched my Why the Luftwaffe failed in World War II, in the beginning of the war, the German had way more training time than the Allies, but this switched over the war, and providing sufficient amount of training and everything is how you keep your Luftwaffe or your Air Force sustainable, because people always forget that you lose a lot of planes and also pilots in regular operations, not just by the enemy. So you have to always bring basically new blood in to sustain the air warfare, because the attrition is so high. And especially pilots and also other like navigators or air crews are very expensive troops, you could say, because you have to put in you have to put in the fuel for the training flights, you have to train them for a long time. It's a very high and technical job. I mean, navigation and everything, it also involves mathematics. So providing that much pilots due to the training is, yeah, a substantial amount for the war effort. And I didn't know that, but if many sources put out that's the most important stuff they contributed, I can certainly see why this is the case.
Yeah, I mean, you can have a lot of powerful armament, you can have a technologically advanced aircraft, but if the guy in it doesn't, or woman in it doesn't know how to fly it, and if there's no fuel in it, you got a problem. So the logistics, human and material, behind it are just as important as the more visible stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So now let's look at the final part, at the land warfare, because I think at D-Day Canada also provided at least one division, right?
Correct. There were five beaches stormed on D-Day. One of them, codenamed Juno Beach, was stormed by a Canadian infantry division. Many Canadians are very proud to mention that elements of that Canadian division advanced farther on June 6th than any other Allied units. That rate of advance and success was not sustainable, though. But I'll say a bit about that in a moment, because the D-Day is maybe the most well-known battle in which Canadians were involved outside of of Canadian historical memory, but Canada's ground combat role, actually the first major engagement was Hong Kong in December 1941. Canada had sent a couple of battalions there, a couple of thousand soldiers there, who were involved in the unsuccessful attempt to defend the island. This is a bit controversial, of course, not only because of the huge, British defeat, but there was discussion about the performance of those troops, how well or how not well they had been trained. I mean, the army was in as poor a state as the Navy before the start of the war, with only 4,000 or 5,000 active regular troops. There was a lot of reluctance, political reluctance, to send troops into combat or to even create a large-scale combat land force. Nonetheless, it became necessary. And then you have conflicting forces, right? You have some in Canada who say we have to be careful, we can't, contribute too much to the land war. And you have others who say, no, we must help Britain, we must do it now. And that's one of the reasons why Canadian troops were selected for the Dieppe raid on the coast of France in 1942, August 1942. And that was a disaster, right? So this was a trauma for Canada. The raid was pretty much a complete failure, even though some lessons were learned that were applied on D-Day a couple of years later. The first large-scale combat was actually in Sicily. In 1943, there was a desire to have Canadian troops contribute in some way, as I say, and so one division was sent down to participate in the Sicilian campaign, and they continued on the Italian campaign until they were eventually transferred back to northwestern Europe. Interestingly, Canadians often have a very positive evaluation of the fighting record of the troops, especially the infantry, in World War I. They're considered amongst most Canadian historians to have been, shock elite combat troops, especially specifically the last 2 years of the First World War. But the situation in World War II is a little more tricky. The performance of Canadian troops in Normandy and trying to capture the city of Caen, trying to close the Falaise Gap, and cut off the Germans before they could regroup and retreat, is a bit of a patchy one in some ways. It was a real struggle, and the British struggled as well. It wasn't only the Canadians. And part of the reason for that was that there was not an overwhelming commitment to taking casualties and to building up the army in the same ways as had been done in World War I. So because no conscription had been imposed, they essentially were running short of volunteers. They could not, by the late summer of 1944, they could not replace combat attrition with fresh bodies. And they were having to press into service less well-trained troops and switch troops from other support services to combat roles, which is quite difficult if you're trained as a cook, and then all of a sudden you need to be fighting an SS division, a Waffen SS division. You're probably not going to have a very easy baptism of fire. And this was a major issue facing the land forces as they advanced across northwestern Europe, to the point where eventually a political risk was taken and conscription was imposed, but as little as possible. So in the end, only about 2,500 non-volunteers reached frontline units. I remember even my grandfather telling me he was in a mechanized infantry unit, and he told me that some of these green, fresh guys would show up transferred from support services, and he and the other combat veterans had a very hard time trying to help them along when they first arrived. I think maybe the most enduring combat for Canada on land in World War II was in Holland. It was really tough going with the wet terrain, the canals, the polders, which were opened up and flooded by the Germans as well. Very easily defensible, cold, wet in the winter of 44, 45, and that was a tough slog. But much of the country was liberated by Canadian troops, and there's still kind of an emotional relationship between the two countries as a result of that.
Now, this is a very interesting aspect you mentioned with the force conservation, basically due to the limits of manpower, because this was also a problem for the British in the late war, because and in another way, the Churchill basically said, okay, in the initial assault on northwestern Europe, we will be there, but then the American troops have to take over, and in a more grand strategic context, since the Allies assumed that Germany would break down in 1944, they already had marked several divisions for shipping them back to the Pacific.
Mhm.
So this is something that is actually not mentioned very well, but Gian Greco, the author of Hell to Pay, noted to me in an email. It was very interesting, and to read up on this, that the whole manpower issue, which is usually not discussed in popular history at all, was affecting so many Western countries on one way or another. And also the aspect of support units or non-combat troops being forced into combat, because the Germans saw this, of course, during Operation Barbarossa in 1941 and then in 1942 again, that it's in a very similar experience in that way that this happens in many armies. It's quite interesting to see this.
Yeah, and one of the aspects of that that I just read about recently is that the Canadians, of course, we were generally speaking, our combat troops at some level were under British command, right? Up to the army level, there was Canadian command, but above that and strategically, we were under British command. And so we adopted a lot of British style systems and equipment and so forth. And one of the British systems that was adopted was the system of replacements. So how do you predict how many guys you need to train to go into this branch, this branch, this branch? And the British model had been developed as a result of their combat experience early in the war in North Africa. And in North Africa, conditions were very different, and the types of casualties sustained were different than what the British and Canadians experienced in France, Belgium, and Holland. And that caused a problem because in North Africa, the German and Italian air forces were quite present and caused a lot of casualties amongst the support services behind the lines and engineers and so on. And that wasn't the case in 1944-45 in Northwestern Europe because the Western Allies had basically complete air supremacy. So that mundane administrative system contributed to the basically to kind of not the right proportion of training men for frontline combat versus training men for support services.
Well, that's very interesting because this is, I think, very different to the German perspective in this case.
What I find so interesting about military history and why I got into it, and this applies to Canada in World War II, there are so many aspects to it. I think some of the questions that people have right off the bat, okay, what was Canada doing in World War II? I mean, as I say, most people outside of Canada, Britain, don't really know much about it. You think, well, how many troops did they have? Where did they fight? How many tanks? All this kind of stuff. But if you follow back from that, if you add the context to that, why were they sent where they were? What were they doing there? What are the decisions? What's the society thinking and doing and reasoning as a part of being involved in this conflict? That's to me what one of the aspects that I find the most interesting about Canada's experience in World War II or one or actually any other participant. I think after the war, Canada looked back on it as many other countries among the Western Allies. It's the good war, right? It's the one that's not. It's much more clear. There's a lot more moral clarity than World War One, and casualties were lower. So it's in a way less traumatic for the society. So we only lost only, of course, that's a difficult word to use, but there were 45,000 Canadians killed in World War II, and the majority of those were not in the army, whereas a much smaller population lost 66,000 in World War One. And I think today, when Canadians think about World War II, it's almost in a more simplistic way than how we think about World War One, even though the divisions, the stresses, the trauma to our country are no less complicated.
Well, I would say this is a wonderful ending. So thank you very much, Jesse.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you for having me, and I hope to do it again sometime.
Definitely. So everyone else, thank you for listening and see you next time. Bye.